the timeless past.
The air doesn't move, hangs, thick and heavy like molten glass. At 128 degrees Fahrenheit, it ceases to be air and becomes a physical presence, an antagonist. It presses in from all sides, seeking entry through the seams of the climate-controlled Jeep. A metal bubble of artificial comfort navigating an ocean of fire. Inside, Dr. Aris Thorne gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. His face, lean and etched with the kind of academic focus that bordered on obsession, was illuminated by the green glow of a GPS display. He was a geologist, a cartographer of deep time. To him, these scorched, wrinkled mountains weren't a wasteland. They were a library, its pages written in strata of sandstone and volcanic ash. He was here to read a chapter no one else had found, a unique confluence of mineral deposits rumored to exist in the valley's most unforgiving and uncharted quarter. A bead of sweat traced a path down his temple, defying the blasting air conditioner. He was pushing it, he knew it. The Park Service maps called this region impassable. His colleagues had called him reckless. His ex-wife, in their last strained phone call, had used a different word. Selfish. He glanced at the passenger seat. Taped to the dashboard was a photograph, faded by a year of sunlight. Girl of about 10. The same intense eyes, but a smile that was entirely her own. Maya, he'd made her a promise before he left. I'll bring you back a stone as old as the world, Munchkin. She hadn't smiled. She'd just looked at him with that unnerving, premature wisdom of a child who has learned that promises are breakable. Almost there, Maya, he whispered to the photo, the sound swallowed by the engine's whine. Just a little further, the Jeep lurched, its heavy-duty tires slipping on a patch of treacherous scree. Aris corrected, his movements precise, practiced. He was not a reckless man by nature. He was a man of calculations, of risk assessment. The potential discovery was worth the risk. The solitude was worth the risk. Escaping the suffocating pity in the eyes of his friends was worth the risk. He believed he had accounted for every variable. Extra water, military-grade rations, a satellite phone for emergencies. He was prepared. He was an expert. It's a dangerous thing, to be an expert in a place that does not obey expert rules. He navigated the vehicle over a rise, the landscape falling away before him into a vast, shimmering basin of cracked earth. The heat haze was so intense it made the distant mountains tremble, as if the world itself was on the verge of melting there. According to his topographical analysis and satellite imagery, the formation should be just ahead, hidden in a small, shadowed canyon carved into the basin's edge. A surge of triumphant energy, the thrill of the hunt, coursed through him. He pressed down on the accelerator, a small, arrogant smile touching his lips, and that's when it happened. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive event. It was a sound. A single, sickening crack that vibrated up from the chassis, through the floor, and directly into the base of his spine. It was a sound of finality, of metal surrendering to stress. The Jeep's front right side dipped violently. The steering wheel was wrenched from his hands, spinning with brutal force. The vehicle slewed sideways, kicking up a plume of ancient dust, and ground to a halt with a long, metallic groan. Silence. The only sound was the frantic ticking of the cooling engine and the high-pitched hum of the AC, now fighting a losing battle. Aris sat motionless for a full 10 seconds. His mind, usually a seamless engine of logic, refused to process the input. It was like a computer encountering a fatal error. This was not part of the calculation. He switched off the ignition. The silence that rushed in was absolute, a physical weight that smothered him. It was a silence composed of a billion years of sun and stone. He pushed the door open, and the heat hit him. It wasn't just a wave, it was a physical blow. A solid wall of thermal energy that stole the breath from his lungs and instantly dried the moisture in his eyes. He stumbled out, his boots sinking into the soft, hot sand. The damage was catastrophic. The front right axle was snapped clean in two, a jagged shard of metal pointing accusingly at the rock that had been its undoing, a rock hidden just beneath the sand like a landmine. His specialized all-terrain, state-of-the-art bubble of civilization was now just a ton of useless, rapidly heating metal. A tombstone. He stood, staring at the broken axle, his mind racing. Okay. Analyze. Don't panic. analyze. He was, by his best estimate, 30 miles from the nearest paved road, Furnace Creek, 30 miles of what he was now standing in. He pulled out the satellite phone. No signal, of course. Nestled between these mineral-rich signal-blocking ranges, he was in a dead zone. He had relied on the Jeep. He had relied on his expertise. He had made a fatal assumption. He looked up at the sun. It wasn't a familiar, friendly star. It was a white, unblinking eye in a bleached-out sky, a celestial tyrant. And he was standing on its anvil. The hammer was about to fall. He scrambled back to the Jeep, his movements now frantic. Panic, cold and sharp, was beginning to slice through the fog of disbelief. Water. He needed to take stock of the water. He had 20 liters in the back, 5 gallons. Under normal conditions, a generous supply, but these were not normal conditions. The survival manuals, the ones he'd skimmed with academic detachment, flashed through his mind. In extreme heat, an adult male can lose over a liter of sweat an hour. You don't just drink to quench thirst. You drink to stay alive. 20 liters. 30 miles. He did the math. The numbers swam before his eyes, distorted by the heat rising from the Jeep's hood. It wasn't enough. Not even close. A profound, soul-crushing despair washed over him. He leaned against the hot metal of the door, his head bowed. He wasn't a geologist anymore. He wasn't Dr. Aris Thorne. He was just a man, made of soft flesh and fragile bone, stranded in a place that had been crushing mountains into dust long before his species learned to walk upright. He looked at the photo of Maya on the dashboard. Her clear, steady gaze seemed to see right through him, past the academic accolades, past the confident exterior, to the hollow space left by his grief and his guilt. The promise he'd made her wasn't about a rock. It was a desperate, clumsy attempt to say, "I'm still here. I'm still your father." And now he was going to break that promise too. No. The word formed in his mind, sharp and defiant. It wasn't a thought. It was a command from some deeper, more primal part of his brain. He pushed himself off the Jeep. His shoulders straightened. The despair was still there, a cold, heavy stone in his gut. But now it was mixed with something else. Anger, a hot, furious rage against the sun, against the stone, against his own catastrophic stupidity. He would not die here, would not become another cautionary tale, another sun-bleached skeleton for future geologists to find. He began to move, his actions deliberate, methodical. The scientist was back in control, but now he was working with a different kind of desperation. He pulled his largest backpack from the Jeep. He carefully loaded it, every item weighed against the cost of its carriage and sweat and calories. 10 liters of water all he could sanely carry. The rest he drank, chugging down to full liters until his stomach sloshed, forcing his body to superhydrate. He left the remaining 8 liters in the Jeep. A gamble. If he failed, they were a pointless burden. If he succeeded, he wouldn't need them. He packed high-energy food bars, a medical kit, a compass, a GPS unit with failing batteries, a signal mirror, his knife. He wrapped a shemug, a desert scarf, around his head and neck, leaving only his sunglasses-clad eyes exposed. He looked at the geological hammers and sample bags, the tools of his trade, of his old life. He left them all behind. They were just dead weight now. As the sun began its slow, merciless descent toward the western peaks, casting long, distorted shadows across the valley, Aris Thorne took his first step. He turned his back on the metallic shell of his broken confidence and began his march. 30 miles, a marathon. But this was a race with no finish line, only a cliff edge. A race against the thirst, against the heat, against the inevitable delirium that he knew was waiting for him out there, shimmering in the heat haze like a patient predator. The devil's anvil awaited his first footfall. He gave it, his boot crunching with grim finality on the salt-crusted earth. The first few hours were a study in brutal monotony. The world was reduced to 3 things: the blinding white of the salt flats under his feet, the crushing weight of the pack on his shoulders, and the sun, the relentless, punishing sun beating down on his back. It was a physical assault. The heat wasn't just in the air. It radiated upwards from the ground, cooking him from below, turning the soles of his boots soft. The landscape was deceptively flat, an immense cracked plate stretching to the horizon. Every step felt the same as the last, a journey through a static, unchanging hell. He walked with the mechanical gait of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. But in the vast, profound silence of the basin, his mind was a roaring amphitheater. Regret was the headline act. "You're always leaving, Dad," Maya's voice, from a memory a month ago. He'd been packing for a conference in Geneva. She stood in the doorway of his study, not crying, just watching him with that unnerving stillness. "It's for my work, Munchkin. It's important. More important than my recital." He'd faltered then. He had forgotten. The piano recital she'd been practicing for all spring? He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes before she masked it, the same way her mother used to. The same way he had taught them both to do. He had promised to make it up to her. This trip, this rock, was supposed to be the start of that. A grand gesture to plaster over 1,000 tiny emotional failures. "What a fool you are, Aris," he stumbled, catching himself before he fell. The salt crunched under his boots like broken glass. Stopped, pulling the water bottle from its pouch. His hand trembled. I unscrewed the cap and allowed himself a single, small sip. The water was hot, tasting of plastic, but it was the most precious substance in the universe. He swished it around, letting his parched mouth absorb every molecule before swallowing. It was a ritual of survival, a sacrament. He was a scientist. He understood the process of dehydration intellectually. First, the body would pull water from the blood, making it thicker, forcing the heart to work harder. Then, it would pull from skin cells, organs. The brain, desperate to protect itself, would shrink, tugging on the membranes connecting it to the skull, causing excruciating headaches. Cognitive function would decay. Logic would fray, replaced by confusion, then hallucination, then madness. He was a walking, ticking clock of physiological decay. He checked his compass, orienting himself toward the distant, jagged line of the Panamint Range where the road to Furnace Creek lay. He forced himself to move, one foot in front of the other. The rhythm was all that mattered. Left, right, survive. As afternoon bled into the harsh, unforgiving light of evening, the landscape began to change. The shadows of the mountains stretched like skeletal fingers across the valley floor. The heat lessened, but only slightly, from an oven to a furnace. The world took on an eerie, beautiful, and terrifying quality. The colors were stark, the bruised purple of the mountains against a sky of burnt orange and blood red. It was the beauty of a freshly inflicted wound. He had to find a place to rest for the night. To continue walking in the dark was to risk a fall, a twisted ankle, a fatal mistake. He saw a small outcropping of rocks a half-mile ahead, a dark stain against the fading light. He fixed on it, his new, singular goal. By the time he reached it, collapsing against the still warm stone, twilight had fallen, and with it came the cold. The speed of the temperature change was shocking. The heat was sucked out of the air, out of the ground, as if a cosmic door had been thrown open to the vacuum of space. He had gone from baking to freezing in under an hour. He fumbled in his pack, his fingers numb and clumsy, pulling out an emergency thermal blanket. He wrapped it around himself, the crinkling of the mylar foil obscenely loud in the crushing silence. He sat there, shivering, and looked up. The sky. Oh, the sky. With no city lights for 100 miles in any direction, the heavens exploded into view. The Milky Way wasn't a faint, cloudy band. It was a torrential river of light, a celestial waterfall of such breathtaking scope and clarity that it felt like he could fall into it. It was a beauty so vast, so indifferent, it was terrifying. It rendered him his struggle, his entire existence, utterly and completely insignificant. He was a speck of dust on a slightly larger speck of dust, shivering in the cold, a brief warm-blooded anomaly in a universe of infinite cold fire. He thought of Maya looking through her small telescope in their backyard, the one he had bought her for her birthday. He had tried to explain the scale of the universe to her, the light years, the nebulae, the dying stars. She had just looked at him and said, "But you can't hear it. It's all quiet." She was right. The silence was the most profound thing out here. It was the sound of eternity. And then, it wasn't silent. Faint scratching sound. Close. Aris froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He slowly turned his head. In the faint starlight, he saw it. A scorpion, its body in iridescent black, its tail arched in a perfect, deadly curve. It was exploring the edge of his boot. Primal, unthinking terror seized him. He didn't scream. He couldn't. His throat was too tight. He remained utterly still, every muscle screaming. The scorpion paused, its pincers twitching, tasting the air. It was a creature born of this place, a perfect expression of the desert's lethal efficiency. It lingered for what felt like an eternity, a tiny, 8-legged god of death, before moving on, disappearing into a crack in the rock. Aris let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, a ragged, shuddering gasp. He didn't sleep that night. He sat with his back pressed against the rock. The foil blanket clutched around him and stared into the darkness, listening for the scuttling of tiny feet, for the rattle of a snake, for the sound of his own mortality creeping closer in the star-drenched freezing dark. The hammer of the sun had been replaced by the chisel of the cold. The anvil, he was learning, worked in many ways. Dawn arrived not as a gentle awakening, but as an assault. The first rays of sun crested the Amargosa range to the east, and it was as if a switch had been flipped. The cold vanished, and the heat began its relentless climb. Aris was already moving. He knew he had to cover as much ground as possible before the sun reached its apex, before the anvil grew white-hot. His body was a wreck. His lips were already cracked and bleeding. A dull, throbbing headache had taken up permanent residence behind his eyes. Every joint ached. But he moved. He ate a chalky, tasteless protein bar, chewing it slowly to create enough saliva to swallow. He allowed himself another small, calculated sip of his hot, plastic-flavored water, at less than 8 liters left. Less than 2 gallons to carry him across 25 miles of hell. The landscape today was different. He had left the salt flats behind and was now traversing a vast, sloping alluvial fan, a wilderness of gravel and sun-blasted rock. The walking was harder, his boots slipping on the loose stone. By mid-morning, the world began to lose its sharp edges. The heat was no longer just an external force, it was inside him, cooking him from within. The shimmering air was no longer a curiosity. It was a curtain behind which reality had begun to warp. He saw water was there, clear as day, a quarter-mile to his left. A perfect, serene pool of impossible blue fringed with green. An oasis. His heart leaped. Hope, fierce and desperate, flooded his system, a jolt of pure adrenaline. He knew about mirages. As a scientist, he understood the physics of them, light refracting through layers of superheated air. But this was different. This was real. It had to be. He could almost feel the coolness on his skin, taste the life-giving water on his tongue. He turned, leaving his straight-line path, and began to walk, then stumble toward it. Just a little further, almost there. He talked to it, a low, desperate murmur. Please, please be real. As he got closer, the oasis didn't get clearer. It receded, shimmered and broke apart, the blue pool dissolving into the bleached brown of the desert floor, the green fringe becoming the flat gray-green of creosote bushes. It was gone. It had never been there. A sound escaped his throat, a raw, guttural cry of such profound despair it sounded like it came from an animal. He fell to his knees, the sharp rocks digging into his flesh, but he didn't feel it. The hope, which had surged so powerfully, now drained away, leaving a vacuum of utter desolation. The desert hadn't just denied him, it had mocked him. It had shown him his deepest desire and snatched it away. Stayed there for a long time on his knees, his head hanging. The sun beat down on his back, a physical punishing weight. The hammer on the anvil. This is it, he thought. This is where it ends. Kneeling in the dust, chasing ghosts. Then he heard her voice, clear as if she were standing right beside him. Get up, Daddy. He snapped his head up, looking around wildly. Nothing, just the vast, empty expanse. The silence. You promised, the voice said again. It was Maya's voice, but it wasn't in his memory. It was in the air, in the shimmering heat. He was hallucinating. The dehydration, the heat, the exhaustion, the cognitive decay he'd clinically anticipated was beginning. The scientist in him screamed a warning. Your brain is failing. This isn't real. But another part of him, the father, the broken man, clung to it. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling violently. Maya, he croaked, his voice a dry rasp. You can't stop. the voice insisted, seeming to come from a spot just ahead of him on his original path. Keep walking. He was going mad. He knew it. But madness was better than despair. Madness was a companion in the emptiness. Madness had a goal. He turned his back on the phantom oasis and began to follow the phantom voice of his daughter. He stumbled forward, a man locked in a dialogue with his own breaking mind. "I'm sorry, Munchkin," he whispered to the shimmering air. "For the recital, for everything." "Just walk," she replied, and so he did. He walked through the long, white-hot hours of the afternoon, a solitary figure moving through a landscape of fever dreams. The world around him became a surreal theater. The rocks took on the shapes of twisted faces, their mouths open in silent screams. The distant mountains looked like slumbering beasts, their stony hides breathing in the heat. He was losing himself. The carefully constructed identity of Dr. Aris Thorne, the logical, empirical, detached observer, was dissolving, burning away under the relentless sun. Something else was emerging, something older, more primal. A creature of pure will, stripped of everything but the need to take one more step. He fell. It was a clumsy, graceless fall, his foot catching on a rock he didn't see. He went down hard, the weight of the pack driving him into the ground. His head hit a stone, not hard enough to knock him out, but with a dull, sickening thud. The world swam in a nauseating blur of white and brown, and then he heard it, the one sound that cut through the delirium, the sound of trickling water. He pushed himself up, his vision clearing slowly. One of his water bottles had been dislodged in the fall. It had struck a sharp rock, and a thin, steady stream of his life was now pouring out, disappearing instantly into the parched, thirsty earth. No, he scrambled for it, his hands shaking, his fingers fumbling with the broken plastic. He tried to plug the hole, but the water ran over his hands, a cruel mockery. By the time he managed to right the bottle, a third of it was gone. A full liter. Gone. Swallowed by the dust. He stared at the wet patch on the ground, at the dark stain that was already shrinking, evaporating before his eyes. That wasn't just water. It was miles. It was hours. It was a future. The anger he had felt before was nothing compared to the rage that now consumed him. It was a white-hot, silent fury. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. Stood up, the broken bottle still in his hand, and he looked at the sun, challenging it. The world had pushed him, mocked him, and broken him. Now he would push back. He secured the leaking bottle upside down in his pack, hoping to salvage what remained. He picked up his path, his steps no longer just a march of survival, but a march of defiance. He was no longer following the phantom of his daughter. He was being driven by a pure, unadulterated fire from within. He would not be beaten on this anvil. He would walk until his heart exploded. He would crawl until his bones were ground to dust. He would not stop. The sun watched, impassive. The anvil waited, patient. The race had entered its final, desperate stage. The third day dawned without ceremony, an unwelcome continuation of the torment. Aris had not rested. It stumbled through the freezing darkness, an automaton powered by rage and grief. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. To stop was to surrender to the cold, to the inertia of despair. He was now a creature of raw survival, every layer of his civilized self stripped away, burned off by the sun, frozen off by the night. His body was a map of his ordeal. His skin, where it was exposed, was a patchwork of angry red sunburn and peeling blisters. His lips were deep, bleeding cracks. His tongue was a swollen foreign object in his mouth, making every breath a chore. He had maybe 2 liters of water left, a pathetic reserve he guarded with a feral intensity. He was deep into the physiological territory from which there was often no return. His mind was a shattered mirror, reflecting fragmented pieces of reality and nightmare. The ghost of Maya no longer led him. She walked beside him, a silent, shimmering companion. Sometimes she was 10 years old, asking him questions about rocks and stars. Other times she was a baby, and he felt the phantom weight of her in his arms. A memory so potent, it made him ache with a love that was indistinguishable from pain. They held long, one-sided conversations. "The rock I was looking for," he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. "It's called sodalite. It's a deep royal blue."
"I like your eyes."
Maya's phantom shimmered. "I was going to polish it. Make it into a sphere. A tiny world for you to hold." A world as old as this one. He gestured with a trembling hand at the hostile landscape. Stupid, wasn't it? Trying to give you a stone when all you ever wanted was my time. He was no longer just walking toward Furnace Creek. He was walking through a confession, a penance performed one agonizing step at a time. This desert had become his crucible, burning away his pride, his intellectual arrogance, his emotional cowardice, leaving only the raw, painful truth of his failings as a husband, as a father. Around noon, a new element entered the landscape. High above, in the bleached white sky, a dark speck appeared, then another vultures. They circled lazily, effortlessly, riding the thermal updrafts that rose from the superheated valley floor. They were masters of this environment, turning the Anvil's heat to their advantage. They didn't flap their wings. They simply soared, patient, black-robed judges in the sky. Aris watched them, his heart a cold knot of dread. They knew. Somehow they knew he was failing. They were waiting for the clock of his physiology to run down. They were the punctuation mark at the end of his sentence. "It's not yet," he snarled at the sky, his voice barely a whisper. "Not for you." The sight of them, so calm and certain, stoked the embers of his defiance back into a flame. He was not meat yet, was still a man. But the world was tilting, the horizon blurring. He knew he was on the edge of collapse. He needed to find shade, any shade at all, to survive the peak heat of the afternoon. He scanned the horizon, his eyes straining against the glare. The landscape was a monotonous expanse of rock and scrub, offering nothing, and then he saw it. It wasn't a mirage. It was too solid, too angular. A dark, straight line against the chaotic jumble of the rocks, about a mile away, nestled at the base of a low hill. It was a structure, a roofline. Hope, that treacherous, beautiful emotion, surged through him again. But this time it was different. It wasn't the desperate leap of a drowning man. It was the calculated focus of a sniper. It was a real target, an old miner's shack, perhaps. A relic from the valley's brief, frantic dance with gold and silver. A tomb for some other poor soul, maybe? No, but a tomb with shade. He adjusted his course, his entire being focused on that single dark line. Every step was a negotiation with his protesting body. His leg muscles screamed, tight knots of agony. His vision pulsed with dark spots. The sun, as if sensing his new purpose, seemed to intensify its assault. The hammer blows coming faster, harder. The vultures circled lower. They were following him. He began to lose track of time. The walk to the shack wasn't measured in minutes, but in heartbeats, in breaths, in the number of times he stumbled and forced himself back to his feet. Maya's ghost had faded, replaced by the stark black shapes of the birds in the sky. They were his escorts now. The sky to the west was changing. Brilliant, merciless blue was being smudged with a dusty, yellowish-brown haze that was growing, swelling, moving with an unnatural speed. A dust storm, a new terror, a new race. Aris's mind, flickering like a dying candle, registered the threat. The wind began to pick up, not a cooling breeze, but a hot sandpaper blast, kicking up grit that stung his face and eyes. He was 100 yards from the shack, 50. The wind was a physical force now, pushing against him, trying to knock him down. The sky was turning a sickly ochre. The sun was blotted out, the world plunged into an apocalyptic twilight. The roar began. A low hum that grew into a deafening, freight train howl as the main wall of the storm descended on the valley. He could see the shack clearly now, a dilapidated structure of weathered wood and rusted tin. Its door hung open on a single hinge, a dark, welcoming mouth. He was crawling, didn't remember falling, but his hands and knees were raw, digging into the gravel. The air was a thick, choking torrent of sand. He couldn't see. He couldn't breathe. He pulled the shemagh over his mouth and nose, but the fine dust still found its way in, coating his already swollen tongue, abrading his throat. He was blind, deafened by the storm's fury, guided only by the memory of where the shack was, crawled, his fingers clawing at the earth. He felt his hand hit something solid. Wood. The wall. With the last, desperate surge of his will, he pulled himself forward, dragging his broken body over the threshold, and collapsed onto the rough plank floor inside. The storm hit the shack with the force of a tidal wave, The wooden walls groaned, the tin roof screamed as it was pelted with sand and gravel, but inside, in the suffocating darkness, there was a relative calm. The roar was muffled. The blinding, stinging chaos was shut out. Aris lay there, face down on the floor, his body convulsing in ragged, dusty gasps. He had made it. He was out of the sun. He was out of the wind. He was in a dark, cramped, foul-smelling box, and it felt like the most glorious palace on earth. He had won. He had beaten the storm. He had cheated the vultures. He lay there for a long time, listening to the symphony of destruction outside, the sound of the desert trying to tear itself apart. And in the darkness, for the first time in 3 days, he wept. They were not tears of sadness or despair. They were tears of savage, painful, exquisite relief. He was alive. The world was reborn in silence. The roar of the sandstorm did not fade. It ceased abruptly, as if a switch had been thrown. The sudden quiet was as profound as the prior chaos had been. Aris, who had drifted into a shallow, feverish state of unconsciousness, was startled awake by it. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. Every movement was an agony of stiff joints and raw skin. Dust motes danced in the single, sharp blade of light that cut through a crack in the shack's wall, illuminating the cramped space. It was a single room, no more than 10 feet square. The air was thick with the smell of dry rot, dust, and the faint metallic scent of forgotten lives. A crude wooden table and a single 3-legged stool stood in the center. In the corner, a rusted pot-bellied stove. Against the far wall, a wooden bunk with a mattress of rotting canvas. This was a place of last resort. A place where a man had once wagered his life against the stone and likely lost. Aris felt a strange kinship with the shack's long-gone inhabitant. He was not the first to suffer here. The woad. His thirst was a raging fire in his throat. He fumbled for his pack, his hands shaking so violently he could barely work the buckles. He retrieved the broken, leaking bottle. There was perhaps a cupful of water left. He drank it, not in sips, but in a single desperate gulp, letting the lukewarm liquid coat his tongue and throat. It was not enough. It was never enough. But it was something. His eyes, now accustomed to the gloom, scanned the room again, and then he saw it. On the table lying next to a corroded tin cup was a book, a small, leather-bound journal. He stumbled over to the table and picked it up. The leather was cracked and stiff, the pages yellow and brittle. He opened it carefully. The inside was filled with a spidery, faded script written in pencil. May 14th, 1898, the vein has pinched out. 2 weeks of dust for my trouble. Water is low. Must try 4 Keeler tomorrow. Sun is a cruel master in this place. Curse the day I ever heard the name California. Aris read on, his finger tracing the faint lines. It was the diary of a prospector named Jedediah Stone. His entries were short, terse accounts of work, of heat, of dwindling supplies, and of a loneliness so profound it seemed to bleed from the page. June 1st, lost the trail in a blow, like the one today. The devil spits, and a man can lose his soul. Drank the last of the water from the barrel. Pray for a cloud. June 3rd. I see her sometimes, my sweet Mary. Standing on the porch back in Missouri, she waves to me. I know it's the heat, but it gives me strength to see her face. Aris's breath caught in his chest. He saw his Mary. I see my Maya, 100 years apart, 2 men, broken and alone in the same God-forsaken spot. Clinging to the phantoms of the women they loved, the gulf of a century vanished. It was no longer Jedediah's story. It was his story. It was every man's story of desperation and love. The final entry was dated June 5th, 1898. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. Sky is clear, no clouds. The vultures are here. They know. I will not let them have me. I will walk out to meet my Maker. On my own 2 feet, Mary, my love. The entry ended there. Aris closed the journal gently, a wave of profound empathy washing over him. Jedediah hadn't made it. What? But he had not surrendered. He had walked out to face his end with dignity. He had not let the anvil be the final word. A new strength, born not of anger or defiance, but of a solemn connection to another's struggle. Settled in Aris, he was not just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for Jedediah, for everyone who had ever faced this crucible and refused to break. The light from the crack in the wall shifted. The sun was setting. The air coming through the gaps in the boards was cooler, cleaner, scoured by the storm. He had shelter for the night, yet a chance. He spent the night in the relative comfort of the shack, huddled on the floor, the prospector's journal clutched in his hand. He did not sleep. He rested, conserving every ounce of energy, his mind strangely calm, lucid, for the first time in days. The delirium had been burned away by his ordeal and cooled by his encounter with the ghost of Jedediah Stone. He was no longer running from his past or chasing mirages. He was simply a man who intended to see the next sunrise. And when that sunrise came, it was glorious. The storm had washed the sky clean. The air was crisp and clear, the light a pure golden hue that made the stark landscape beautiful. He stood in the doorway of the shack looking out. From this slightly elevated position, he could see for miles. The world looked fresh, new, and then he saw it. It was miles away, a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker on the horizon to the east. It wasn't a mirage. Mirages shimmered. They were ethereal. This was a hard, sharp glint of light. It vanished, then appeared again. The sun, rising behind him, was striking something reflective, something made of metal and glass. Car. On the road. His heart didn't leap. It began to beat with a slow, powerful, steady rhythm. This was it, the chance, but he was miles away. It would never see him, a tiny speck in the vastness. He had nothing left. No energy for shouting, no strength for running. He looked around the shack, his eyes scanning for anything, any tool. His gaze fell on the rusted tin cup on the table. It was dull, corroded. Then he looked down at his pack. The signal mirror. Had forgotten about the signal mirror. Leave. He fumbled it out, his hands still trembling, but this time with anticipation, not weakness. He stepped out of the shack, into the full, glorious light of the morning. He held the small mirror in his hand. He knew the principle. Angle the mirror to catch the sun, and aim the reflection at the target. He could see the flash from the car, a tiny star on the horizon. They were moving, driving along the distant highway. He held the mirror up, tilting it, trying to catch the sun. A brilliant, dazzling beam of light shot out from his hand. He aimed it toward the distant glint, sweeping it back and forth. A tiny, desperate prayer cast in photons. He stood there, a solitary, skeletal figure in the immense, silent valley. His clothes were rags, his body was a wreck, but his arm was steady. He held the mirror, flashing, flashing, flashing. A tiny beacon of defiance against the vast, indifferent wilderness. He didn't know if they could see him. The odds were astronomical. He might as well have been trying to signal a ship from a desert island, but he didn't stop. He held his ground, his feet planted on the anvil. He was no longer the arrogant scientist who had entered this valley. He was not the broken man who had chased ghosts across the salt. He was something else, something forged. He had been heated in the furnace of the sun, hammered by thirst and despair, and quenched in a storm of dust and fear. What emerged was leaner, harder, stripped of all that was unnecessary. The glint on the horizon continued on its path. It grew no larger. He kept flashing the mirror. He would keep flashing it until his arm gave out. He would keep flashing it until the sun set. He would not give up. He owed it to Maya. He owed it to Jedediah. He owed it to himself. The camera begins to pull back slowly, rising higher and higher. Aris becomes a smaller and smaller figure in the vast epic landscape. He is just a speck, but from his hand, a tiny, brilliant star of light continues to pulse. A heartbeat of hope in the heart of desolation.